decided I'm going to do another Bitcoin magazine read from the Gatekeepers edition. Today, the piece I'm reading is one by Shinobi. This was an excellent piece, and I hope you guys enjoy listening as much as I enjoyed reading it for the first time. This piece is titled, Who Gatekeeps Whom by Shinobi. One of the most enduring narratives of the last 10 years surrounding the Bitcoin project has been the perception of Bitcoin core developers as self-anointed gatekeepers of Bitcoin. At first, this attitude was only widely present among the big blockers who were obsessively focused on a removal of the block size limit, which restrained resource usage requirements for people wishing to fully validate the state of the blockchain. In recent years, this attitude has crept further and further into the mainstream thinking among Bitcoiners who do not have such radical intentions to fundamentally alter such an important aspect of Bitcoin's nature. It is not an entirely incomprehensible dynamic that has led to this attitude growing more prominent. Bitcoiners tend to be different combinations of self-confident, assertive, mistrusting, and in many cases and topics, uninformed or lacking in understanding. When it comes to people very confidently and with a deep understanding of the topic, discussing things that do not align with the current narrative, combined with these personality characteristics on the part of the listener, it is not surprising that developers are not to be trusted, is a common conclusion. From there, it is not hard to make the next leap to perceiving them as gatekeepers who must be appeased in order to actually enact some change to Bitcoin. It especially encourages this dynamic when people hear a deep technical criticism of some proposed change that on the surface sounds like a good idea to them, but in reality has massive negative consequences. Why won't they support this thing that is good for Bitcoin? There must be some ulterior motive. There is a reason why the notion of the default is no change exists when proposing changes to the Bitcoin protocol. If what we have is working without obvious problems, unless you competently explain the implications of the changes proposed, the rational default position is this works just fine. Why don't we increase the block size limit so that more people can afford to transact on-chain? Why don't we add the Ethereum smart contracting language Solidity to the Bitcoin protocol? Why don't we change from proof of work to proof of stake? There are literally an infinite number of changes you can make to Bitcoin for an equally infinite number of reasons. Everything comes with arguable upsides and downsides. Imagine if every person who wanted to change Bitcoin could just snap their fingers and change it. The entire value and utility of it would be finished. Bitcoin's slowness to change is a large part of the value it has in the first place. Users can be sure consensus can't be changed out from underneath them. So why is Bitcoin so slow to change? The gatekeepers. The development process. Bitcoin has only gotten to where it is today because of the work of a large group of software developers who have chosen to spend their time working on improving the efficiency and safety of both Bitcoin Core as a piece of software and the Bitcoin protocol itself, which Core implements. Software needs developers. It doesn't just spring into existence out of nowhere all by itself. And Bitcoin is software. This is just an inescapable reality, like needing mechanics for cars, engineers for buildings, etc. Every protocol, tool, device, technique, or technology we use as a society is made by humans, maintained by humans, and designed by humans. Bitcoin protocol developers are literally the engineers of Bitcoin. They optimize the design, extend it where it is necessary, and maintain the pieces of it that are already there. There have been many brilliant developers, mediocre developers, incompetent developers, and even malicious developers. The process of actually designing, implementing, and deploying changes to the code, whether at the consensus layer or parts that have nothing to do with consensus, is a sometimes messy but absolute necessity that undeniably and objectively does involve a form of gatekeeping. It necessarily must gatekeep in order to actually be a functional and coherent process that produces usable and safe results. What's the old adage? A camel is a horse designed by committee. Everyone jumping into a design or engineering decision to give their 2 cents generally devolves into a gigantic mess, with the end result being something subpar. Bitcoin development is by necessity in large part exactly that, designed by committee. There is no head of Bitcoin, no real hierarchy in project decision making. Satoshi disappeared over 10 years ago, and the one person who attempted to place themselves in that role, Gavin Andresen, would end up fading off into irrelevance. Why did he fade away to irrelevance? Because the development process and the gatekeeping inherently involved successfully prevented him from pushing harmful changes into Bitcoin Core itself. So how does the gatekeeping process work? If you want to write code for Bitcoin Core, whether it actually creates a new protocol level change or not, you can literally just do it. Fork the repo and start coding. Bitcoin is permissionless in that regard. The code is right there in public with nothing stopping you from altering it. The gatekeeping process is everything in between writing the code and getting anyone other than yourself to run it. No one can stop you from writing code or running it yourself. There's a lot more to it than that. Any code alteration to Bitcoin Core can wind up compiled and running on your own machine within hours. Any code change, you can increase the block size to whatever you want. You can add any new opcode functionality that you can dream up and program. However, all of that is meaningless, at least when it comes to anything consensus related. If you're the only person running that version of the software, you can increase the block size to 1 terabyte, but if no other users or miners run that software as well, that terabyte block will never come, and your code change will not matter at all. That new opcode will never be usable. Code needs to make it into the software that other people run in order to matter. This entire process is a long and slow matter of making sure everything is up to snuff. Other contributors need to audit the proposed code changes and ensure that the behavior is correct, i.e., it does only what it was intended to do and nothing else. All software has bugs, but other software doesn't have to maintain the exact same outcome of every piece of data run through every copy of it in order to ensure the global continuity of a decentralized money system. A bug that would otherwise be innocuous in some other piece of software could be disastrous in Bitcoin. Anything from individual users losing money to a catastrophic failure of the system. In Bitcoin, there are no bosses and there are no job assignments. There is no lead developer handing out tasks such as reviewing pull requests for junior developers. People contribute where, when, and how they choose. Writing code does not mean that it will instantly get reviewed. You actually have to convince enough developers that the proposal you are putting forward is useful and logical enough to go through the time to review it for bugs or errors. There is no one except the individual developer deciding how to allocate the time they contribute to Bitcoin. The onus is on the person writing the code in order to get it reviewed thoroughly enough for it to be considered safe to fully integrate it into software. All of these steps in getting code merged are literally examples of gatekeeping. Ensuring that code is bug-free, gatekeeping. Deciding whether or not to allocate your time to reviewing the code at all, gatekeeping. Deciding whether a proposal is even logical or safe in the first place and voicing that opinion to others involved in the development process, gatekeeping. And you know what? That is a good thing. That is exactly what ultimately contributed to the defense against people like Gavin Andresen when they attempted to alter Bitcoin in a way that would have permanently destroyed its decentralization and the value proposition that presented. So does this mean developers dictate the direction of Bitcoin? No. Developers have gatekeepers as well. Who gatekeeps the gatekeepers? Even though at the time he was the so-called lead developer of Bitcoin, one of the maintainers who could merge code into one of the many copies of Bitcoin Core source code on GitHub, Gavin's push for big blocks was not well received by other developers. No such change was ever actually merged by Bitcoin Core. Instead, what Gavin and other developers who felt the same did was actually write and release new software with the changes they wanted. They then went about trying to convince users and businesses to adopt their software instead. There have been a few different attempts over the years, Bitcoin Classic, Bitcoin XT, Bitcoin Unlimited, all going to different extremes in how much they changed the block size. They were all driving at the same ultimate goal though, eventually culminating in 2017 during the UASF, User-Activated Soft Fork, SegWit 2x4. No other project in this space, other than Ethereum during the DAO hack, has ever seen anything so contentious in terms of attempts to alter the underlying protocol. It's an important point to make, however, because as much as the development process itself shows that developers do gatekeep other developers from pushing changes, this historical period shows that developers themselves are in fact gatekept from changes they deploy in code actually being activated on the real network. The entire period was a complete mess of businesses, developers, users, and miners all engaged in the metaphorical equivalent of standing in a conference room shouting at each other while voicing their opinions on absolutely everything. A large part of what Gavin and company did in order to get around other Bitcoin Core developers refusing to implement a block size increase was lobbying and communicating with businesses. He made a compelling case to a large number of different businesses as to why increasing the block size was actually a good idea. Each time, businesses were met with a huge backlash from their customers and other Bitcoin users for voicing their support to increase block size. Gavin and a handful of developers released their own software client to bypass the gatekeeping that had kept their desired changes out of Bitcoin Core. Their plan was to convince businesses and users to utilize their software instead of Bitcoin Core, thereby enacting a change to Bitcoin despite Core's gatekeeping in the development process. They failed. Why? Because users and customers of those businesses engaged in their own form of gatekeeping. As I said earlier, you can run whatever software you want, but in the context of Bitcoin, that doesn't mean anything unless everyone else runs the same software. Even if those businesses did go through with a fork on their own, if their customers didn't follow along, the companies would effectively be losing their business. If a business in this space is not running the same protocol that users are, then the service they are offering is worthless to those users. It is literally gatekeepers all the way down. Developers keep other developers in check. Businesses keep developers and other businesses in check. Users keep other users, businesses, and developers in check. How this layering is structured is crucial. Developers on top, then businesses, and then users. The key dynamic is that no one can keep in check someone on the layer below them. Developers can't just push a change on businesses or users. If a change developers made was completely out of line with what people wanted, they would simply refuse to run it. If developers refused to write the software people wanted to run, then everyone would eventually wind up running software that did what they wanted. A business cannot force things on users because ultimately, if it wasn't what users wanted, they would simply stop patronizing that business. A user can't even force other users to adopt the change. All they can do is enact a change for themselves and find the equilibrium between other users who do or do not enact a change. Anyone not okay with that equilibrium is free to leave it and find one with other like-minded users. Every man is his own gatekeeper. Earlier, I made the classic joke about design by committee. It is literally the most ineffective and inefficient way to design anything imaginable. Everyone involved in the committee is going to have their input on everything, and it will have to be considered and taken into account, and thus no change will happen until everyone involved is happy with whatever is done, and the compromise is needed to get there. In a nutshell, it's literally the inefficiency of government causing disastrous results. It's also ironically what actually makes Bitcoin functional as a decentralized system. Maybe everyone doesn't show up to every meeting or pitch in on every topic, but whenever they want to, literally everyone can add their opinion to the process. Bitcoin philosophically and ethically aspires to create a system free from gatekeepers. The core value proposition of the system literally depends on it. Bitcoin is useful and valued by people exactly because of the fact that anyone can use it without permission, without the need to appease gatekeepers. That is true of the system. It is core to it. But it ironically requires gatekeeping within the nature of the system itself. A system that can be arbitrarily and easily changed cannot be a system that is usable without the permission of gatekeepers. If it is easily changed, people can be easily prevented from using it. This is the ultimate paradox of Bitcoin. Freedom from gatekeepers by gatekeeping. Can this dynamic unbalance itself? Can it go wrong in a detrimental or stunning way? Yes, it absolutely can. Incredibly useful changes to Bitcoin could never become a part of the protocol, and it won't be because of developers. Ultimately, it will be because of the users refusing to adopt rational and useful changes. On the other hand, if this gatekeeping was not an inherent part of the process, incredibly destructive and damaging changes could be pushed through that undermine Bitcoin at a fundamental level. This would also ultimately be because of users, not developers. This is the needle that Bitcoin must thread, the balancing act everyone has to pull. Bitcoin cannot rid the world of gatekeepers, but at least regarding Bitcoin itself, it can let everyone keep their own gate. Kudos to Shinobi. What a fantastic piece. As I reflect on my own takeaway from Shinobi's piece, I'm reminded of a conversation I recently had with my partner about how being closed-minded versus being open-minded isn't such a black and white issue. I feel like a lot of times people associate open-mindedness with positive connotations and closed-mindedness with negative connotations. But I think it's kind of a paradox because, yes, you want to have an open enough mind to be able to change your mind when new facts or data present themselves. Yes, you want to be receptive to innovations that could occur. Think about all the people who said the internet's not going to be anything. And obviously, with the benefit of 20 years plus of hindsight, well, the internet's changed everything. Every business nowadays, I can't think of an example off the top of my head of a business that does not use the internet. Yet when the internet first came out, that seemed like that would be insane, that every business would be using it. This is probably something mostly for tech companies, is what a lot of people, I bet, said. So when it comes to being open-minded versus closed-minded, yes, I think it is important to have an open mind, but I think there's value in closed-mindedness too. Being closed-minded enough to set aside stupid ideas or to ignore things where there's just not enough data or facts or consensus around whatever that thing might be. It's not a black and white issue. I think it's the same thing with Bitcoin's paradox about gatekeeping. On the face of it, like gatekeeping seems like a negative thing, especially in a decentralized system like Bitcoin. We don't want gatekeepers. This is a permissionless protocol to send money. We don't need permission from anyone. But to Shinobi's point, without gatekeepers, the protocol would be corrupted, and then you wouldn't be able to permissionlessly send value. So I think it's just a fine line, and extracting the best parts of gatekeeping. You know, that was hilarious. A camel is just a horse designed by committee, and I think there is a lot of insight in that. You know, and when you have a ton of people who all have different incentives and motives, things can get messy. But the way that Bitcoin is designed, the way the incentives are set up, so that what secures the network is people's self-interest, people's selfishness. It's a beautiful thing, because while I do believe in the goodness of humanity, I also think we are all self-interested, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I just think it's such an interesting paradox with both gatekeeping, with both open-mindedness and closed-mindedness to consider, and to really think through how you can optimize the best of both of those things. Where can you remove gatekeepers in your life, and where do you think gatekeepers are valuable in your life? What parts of your mind do you want to keep open, and what parts, if you have to be closed-minded enough to have a set of principles, a set of values, a set of beliefs that I'm going to do something this way. And if your mind is just open to anything, well, it can be very easily corrupted. So yeah, all that to say, the world is not black and white by any means. There's gray everywhere. And I think the second you start seeing things in black and white is the second that you lose sight of truth, capital T truth.